You never expect the moment your identity collapses to be the beginning of your greatest opportunity. Yet for many people who later become wildly successful, that exact moment becomes the turning point that rewrites everything they thought they knew about themselves. There comes a day when the mirror reflects someone unfamiliar, when the job title disappears, when the routine ends, when the role you spent years protecting suddenly evaporates, and you are left standing in silence, asking the most terrifying question a human mind can ask: who am I now? Most people interpret this moment as failure, as loss, as humiliation. But what if this moment is actually the doorway to reinvention, the birthplace of a stronger identity, the first step toward the life you secretly wished you had the courage to pursue? The truth is that identity is not fixed, it is constructed. And once you realize that you built it once, you begin to understand that you can build it again, intentionally, powerfully, and differently. When the world strips away your labels, it also strips away your limitations, and that blank space becomes a canvas waiting for a new design. The philosophy often associated with Dr. Grandpa Henry teaches that crisis is rarely the enemy. Instead, it is the uncomfortable mentor that forces growth when comfort has made growth impossible. When your identity breaks, your mind panics because certainty disappears, and the brain prefers painful familiarity over uncertain possibility. Yet this discomfort is proof that transformation has begun. You start questioning old beliefs, old routines, old dreams that no longer fit, and in that questioning lies the raw material of reinvention. Think about how many people live entire lives wearing identities they never consciously chose, shaped by expectations, traditions, fears, and safe decisions that slowly build invisible cages. Then suddenly, life removes the cage door, and instead of walking out, many people freeze because freedom feels unfamiliar and dangerous. But for a small group of people, the ones who later become innovators, leaders, and creators, that open door feels terrifying and thrilling at the same time. They step forward, not because they are fearless, but because they are willing to be uncertain. Identity crisis becomes their training ground, their laboratory, their proving ground, where the old self dissolves and the new self begins to take shape. This process does not happen in comfort, and it does not happen quickly. It begins with confusion, continues with doubt, and eventually evolves into clarity. But the early stage feels like walking through fog with no map and no guarantee of arrival. Yet inside that fog, something powerful is happening. The mind starts asking new questions, the heart starts imagining new futures, and the possibility of a different life quietly begins to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the loss you are grieving is actually the beginning of everything you were meant to become. At first, the silence that follows an identity collapse feels unbearable, like standing in a vast empty room where every echo reminds you of what used to be. And the mind begins replaying memories like old recordings that refuse to stop. You remember the certainty, the routines, the recognition, the comfort of knowing exactly how to introduce yourself when someone asked what you did, and now that answer feels incomplete or painfully outdated. This is the stage where most people desperately try to rebuild the old identity, to glue the broken pieces together, to pretend nothing has changed, because the unknown feels far more frightening than the familiar struggle they already understand. But this is where the real tension begins to grow. The suspenseful moment when a quiet realization starts forming beneath the surface. What if the old identity was never meant to be permanent? What if it was only a chapter that prepared you for the next one? This realization does not arrive as confidence, it arrives as discomfort, as restlessness, as a subtle feeling that returning to the past would feel smaller than moving toward the unknown. The philosophy inspired by Dr. Grandpa Henry suggests that this moment is the psychological crossroads where fear and possibility collide, and the direction you choose determines whether the crisis becomes a prison or a launching pad. The brain resists change because it seeks safety, yet growth demands change because safety rarely creates transformation. This internal conflict becomes a daily battle between the voice that says, "Stay where you are," and the voice that whispers, "There is more waiting ahead." Days pass, and the uncertainty stretches longer than expected, and doubt grows louder, asking whether reinvention is just a fantasy created to soften disappointment. This is the emotional midpoint where many people quit, convincing themselves that stability is better than risk, that security is better than possibility, that ordinary is safer than extraordinary. Yet beneath the doubt, curiosity begins to grow like a quiet spark, refusing to go out. Small questions begin to replace overwhelming fear. What skills could I learn? What path could I explore? What version of myself have I never allowed to exist? These questions feel small, but they are the early signs of identity reconstruction, the mental scaffolding of a new self slowly rising in place of the old one. Suspense builds because the outcome is still invisible, the destination still uncertain, and the journey still fragile. Every step forward feels experimental, like testing ice that might crack beneath your feet, and every decision carries the weight of possibility and risk. Yet something remarkable happens during this fragile stage. The fear that once felt paralyzing begins to transform into energy. The uncertainty that once felt threatening begins to feel like freedom. The emptiness that once felt terrifying begins to feel like space waiting to be filled with intention. And in this quiet transformation, the realization begins to emerge that the person you are becoming might be stronger, braver, and more aligned than the person you were before everything fell apart. Eventually, the fog begins to lift. Not all at once, but in quiet moments when you realize that the questions that once frightened you now feel empowering, and the uncertainty that once felt like chaos now feels like possibility waiting to be shaped. This is the stage where the rebuilding becomes intentional, where identity stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something you consciously design. You begin to notice new habits forming, new interests gaining strength, new goals appearing with a clarity that never existed before the collapse. The past no longer feels like a destination you must return to, but like a lesson that prepared you for a future you are finally ready to claim. The teachings often linked to Dr. Grandpa Henry remind us that reinvention is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more of who you were always meant to be before fear convinced you to settle. You begin to realize that the identity crisis did not destroy your life. It removed the version of your life that was too small for your potential. With this understanding comes a powerful shift in perspective, because you no longer see failure as the end of the road, but as a signal pointing toward a new direction. Confidence grows slowly, like sunlight returning after a long storm, and with each step forward, you start trusting yourself in ways you never did before. The same uncertainty that once terrified you now fuels your creativity, your ambition, and your willingness to take risks that once seemed impossible. This is where the transformation becomes visible, where the person who once felt lost begins to move with intention and purpose. The habits become consistent, the vision becomes clearer, and the belief in your ability to shape your own path becomes stronger than the fear that once held you back. You start to understand that identity is not a fixed label, but a living story that evolves with every decision you make. The people who eventually build extraordinary lives are not the ones who avoided identity crises, but the ones who use them as opportunities to rebuild stronger foundations. The moment that once felt like the lowest point becomes the origin of a completely new chapter, one written with courage, awareness, and deliberate choice. And as you look forward, you realize that the future no longer feels like something that happens to you, but something you actively create, day by day, decision by decision, belief by belief. The identity crisis that once felt like the end has quietly transformed into the beginning of the life you were always capable of building. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.